Hey guys, I'm Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist, nomadcapitalist.com here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And we recently made a video on U.S. citizenship renunciation, talking about my experience. And one of the biggest questions that I've been asked, one of the biggest questions that people who want advice on renouncing citizenship or trying to determine if they want to renounce citizenship ask me, is how do you get back into the United States? Now, this could apply to people who haven't renounced U.S. citizenship, but I'm going to focus largely on former U.S. citizens and how you can visit the United States. There are a lot of misconceptions out there, even among people and websites who largely have the facts correct. There are some misconceptions. And so to break that down, I want to go over the three categories of people who can enter the United States, how the world is viewed by the U.S. government for immigration purposes for tourism, non-immigrant tourist visas. And the first category is Canadians. Canadians, similar to Brits in Hong Kong, have a greater visa-free travel window into the United States without doing anything. This is most likely due to the geographic proximity of Canada to the United States, the great relationship between Canada and the United States. Canada, sadly, has gone to copying some of the U.S.'s more draconian policies, one of which we'll talk about in this video. But Canadians have special travel privileges that really nobody else does. If you're a Canadian, you are the only people on Earth, outside of course, U.S. citizens, who can enter the United States without filling out any forms, without going to any websites, without doing anything. You just go to the border, you get on a plane, you do whatever you have to do, you get into the United States, and you are greeted on arrival. United States citizens have that unique reciprocal privilege with Canada as well. So when I was a U.S. citizen, you would fly through Canada, you'd go through immigration, you wouldn't need to show anything, you would just go through. So that's category one. Category two are what's called the visa waiver program countries. There are, I believe, 39 different countries, right around 39 or 40 countries, in addition to Canada, that are part of the visa waiver program. Generally what the U.S. looks for is they want a visa refusal rate over time of 3% or less. So if your country, people who go to apply for visas are rejected less than 3% of the time, then your country may be put on a roadmap list to eventually become a visa waiver program country. One of the more recent entrants was Chile, which now has visa-free access. One country that used to have it up until about 2001 was Argentina, due to the riots and the financial instability there back then. The U.S. took it away. So there are, like I said, about 39 countries. Most of these are in Western Europe, Australia, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, all the usual suspects. I mean, really, this is a rather small percentage of the world's population, but it is all the wealthy countries. And these are what I often refer to as Tier A passports. Passports that can get you into the United States. But there's one difference between these passports and the Canadian passport, and that is that these countries need to fill out ESTA. This is an electronic travel authorization. Canada copied this from the United States. Australia has their own. Europe is going to be implementing their own rather soon. And this is where you have to go online before you travel, once every, I believe it's 2 years. And you have to register your passport, and you have to register that you're coming to the United States. You've got to pay a very small fee of $14, and they run your information through a database, and more than 99% of the time they approve you. You print out the little form, and you show it at the airport counter if asked. You have to do that once every 2 years. You can do it for multiple trips within 2 years, but you've got to do it once every 2 years if you have a visa waiver program passport, or else you're not going to be allowed in. That system was introduced after 9/11 to basically screen out the worst of the worst and not have to do that at the U.S. border. So what that means, and what one of the misconceptions is that someone will say, if you have a visa waiver program passport, you can renounce U.S. citizenship and then enter the United States the next day. That's actually not true, because if we're looking at a conservative reading, ESTA has to be applied for 72 hours before you travel. I think that you would be denied ESTA, or you should be denied ESTA under the law, if you applied for ESTA while you were still a U.S. citizen. So, I mean, technically when you go to the second U.S. citizenship appointment, you're no longer a U.S. citizen. And so I would say At that point of the next day, you could apply. 3 days from then, you could actually enter the United States on your visa waiver program passport. Now, the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the U.S. Embassy, I have seen historically, will often say, hey, do you want to keep your U.S. passport to, if you need to do any travel, especially travel to the United States, because even after you renounce and you're technically no longer a U.S. citizen, there's kind of this period of limbo where it hasn't been approved by the State Department. They could still reject your renunciation. And so, are you a U.S. citizen? Are you not a U.S. citizen? I had somebody who would come to me who had a visa waiver program passport, renounced, but actually had a trip planned to the United States for a conference after he renounced, and they allowed him to take his U.S. passport and actually enter the United States even though he had just renounced. I think that opens up some weird kind of arguments for the government, potentially for the IRS, just my humble opinion. But that's how ESTA would work. So if you've got a visa waiver program passport, I know another guy who renounced, who is Swiss, says it's easier than it was as a U.S. citizen to get into the country. You just file ESTA once every 2 years and you come on in. He's never had any problems. I've never heard of anyone have any problems. Now, the third category is the category that most people in the world fall into, and that is where you need a U.S. visa. And this is where you've got to go to the U.S. Embassy, you've got to have tons of paperwork, you've got to pay $160. The interesting thing is, there are some people with visa waiver program passports who also have to go and apply for tourist visas. And that is, if you're a visa waiver program country citizen, but you've been to Iran, Iraq, Sudan, perhaps North Korea, prior to, I believe it's 2012, you actually have to go and apply for a U.S. visa. I knew a British guy who had been to Iran after the law was implemented, and he had to go and he had to get a U.S. visa. Now, the interesting thing about getting an actual U.S. visa, that again, there's some misconceptions about on the internet, is under the visa waiver program, you get 90 days at a time. And because you're just basically showing up after filling out ESTA, they'll ask you when you're coming, where you're going, and obviously you should be truthful in that. But if you're saying, hey, I'm coming here on holiday for 90 days, they probably accept that. With the U.S. visa process, when you get a B1, B2 visa, it is for up to 180 days at a time. But really, especially in the early days, when you apply for a visa and you say, hey, I'm going to Miami, I'm going to stay at the Edition Hotel on the beach, and I'm going for 10 days, if you stay for 90 days, you're going to have some problems afterwards. So even though it's a 180-day visa, if you're telling them what your travel plans are in advance, you have to be honest about that, and you don't want to have any problems by just staying longer than you said you would, even if the visa technically allows for it. So what happens if you renounce your citizenship, you don't have a visa waiver program passport, that Tier A passport? What happens if you have what I would call a Tier B or a Tier C passport? Well, you've got to go to the U.S. Embassy, you've got to demonstrate here's where I live, and you've got to make the same case for why you're going to return to your home country as everyone else. There was a big guy from the Bitcoin community a couple years ago who got an economic citizenship, renounced U.S. citizenship, then wanted to apply for a visa, and the speculation was that he did not have enough substantial ties somewhere. He was living this kind of nomadic lifestyle. He had this Caribbean island passport. He wasn't living in the Caribbean island, and they said, we believe that you might have immigrant intent, because where are you going to return? How do we know where you're going to go home? You don't have a home. You don't have money in the bank. You don't have friends. You don't have everything that normal people have in one country. So you've got to prove that you don't have immigrant intent. And so if you have a decent amount of money, if you have a home, that kind of stuff, then that's what they want to see. And so the challenge with getting a visa that is a 6-month visa is that there are other considerations financially that you have to be aware of. That if you spend 6 months, you're going to have some financial considerations to take into account. So those are the 3 categories of folks. If you renounce U.S. citizenship, it's important that you understand how you can get back into the United States. Obviously, anyone who's not a U.S. citizen has no guaranteed right to get back into the United States. They can accept or deny anyone. Now, there are other ways for people who say, I don't want to get a tourist visa, even though a lot of people who are serious people can get a 10-year or even a 2-year tourist visa. You don't have to go every 30 days. even though you get a multiple entry tourist visa in most cases. If you want more, there are other programs that you can do that are both immigrant and non-immigrant by making investments in the United States. Those might be worth considering for certain people. So there are certain kinds of second passports that are better than others. If your intent at some point in the future is to start a business in the US, spend some time running that business in the US, that should definitely be kept under consideration. So if you're planning on renouncing, I think it's important to kind of take in the whole set of facts. I've had people who have come to me saying, Andrew, I just renounced. I bought a passport from one of these guys who sells them off the back of a truck, and they didn't tell me what to do with my bank accounts. They didn't tell me what to do with the properties I own. They didn't tell me how to get visas. They didn't tell me how to do anything. Now I don't know what to do. I think it's important to consider all the facts before you make a decision and before you actually go through the process, so that you know what your life is going to look like 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. If you're getting second passports, especially through investment, it might be worth paying a little bit more to get one that gives you a little bit better access to the US, depending on what you want to do there. So these are all things to be aware of, and you definitely want to take these things into consideration. Now, if you want to learn more about second passports, if you want to learn more about the global citizen lifestyle we talk about here at Nomad Capitalist, 2 things you should definitely do. Number 1, subscribe to our channel. We've got lots of videos, and you will want to see everything that we put out, so subscribe now. The second thing is nomadcapitalist.com. If you're trying to figure out exactly what the strategy is, you can go there, you can get some advice, you can get some help at nomadcapitalist.com.